Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the Off-Grid Solar Market Trends Report. My name is Sarah Malm, and I am the Executive Director of GOGLA. I'd like to welcome everyone here, especially the GOGLA members, and also give the broader audience just a warm welcome. This is an exciting opportunity for us to dig into this market trends report. So let me just start off. GOGLA is the voice of the off-grid sector, and we drive progress and support our 200 plus members by serving as a central hub for the industry, offering vital market data and advocating for supportive policies and increased investment. Today, we are going to take a look at the state of the off-grid sector and the data and insights presented in the Off-Grid Solar Market Trends Report. We are joined by a panel that brings deep experience and perspective from the industry. So let me start by introducing our panelists. Fanny Missfeldt-Ringius, who is the Practice Manager for the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, or ESMAP. Raihan, Elahi, Lead Energy Specialist from the World Bank. Patrick Walsh, the co-founder and CEO of Sun King, and Andrea, Arricale, Energy Specialist and Consultant from the World Bank. So today, we will run through a few comments, the MTR presentation. We will have a panel discussion and then open for Q&A. Please use the chat function for the question and answer period. So for more than a decade, the Off-Grid Market Trends Report has been the sector's flagship publication produced by the World Bank, ESMAP, and GOGLA from support from key partners. It is considered the state of the sector report for the off-grid industry, providing essential data and analysis to inform the industry, investors, and policymakers. The World Bank and GOGLA have been collaborating on the MTR for close to a decade. And in addition to the MTR, in 2016, GOGLA took over gathering data and tracking trends in the off-grid sector from the World Bank and publishes data on sales, impact, investment, and performance every year. The purpose and audience of the MTR is diverse. So for off-grid companies, it really offers insights on consumer trends and business models and helps inform business decisions and operations. For policymakers and national governments, it's really a guide to help on integrated energy planning and to make sure that off-grid is included in energy transition strategies. For investors, it provides important market intelligence to identify opportunities and mitigate risks in the off-grid sector. For development partners and donors, it informs funding priorities and design and program to help align with the sector's needs. And then for energy access advocates, it's a really important tool to help track progress towards universal access and SDG 7. So just a little bit about the report. So building on previous editions, this 2024 Market Trends Report focuses on the state of the off-grid sector and explores key trends in supply, demand, finance, and policy over the last 2 years. The MTR also looks at the off-grid sector contribution to universal energy access. So traditionally, the MTR just focused on off-grid solar energy kits, including solar lanterns and home systems. In 2022, the scope of the report expanded to include products associated with productive use of energy, things like solar pumps and refrigerators that are used. This time, the MTR also included information and data about bringing electricity to social infrastructure, such as schools and health facilities, and gives a very comprehensive overview of the products considered in these connections. Mini grids and clean cooking systems are out of scope of the report. The report also looks at energy access and deficits in humanitarian settings. So Andrea is going to take us through the report, and I don't want to steal anything from his presentation, but I just want to leave you with a few thoughts. So this report comes at a really critical and difficult time for the sector, with very challenging macroeconomic conditions and insufficient investment to support a sustainable off-grid sector that can deliver on energy access goals and power economic growth. So what's really holding back the off-grid sector? It's investment. Off-grid companies require investments, including grants and subsidies, to be profitable and deliver on commercial goals and maximize social value by delivering on energy access goals. Off-grid solar is the most cost-efficient solution to reach upwards of 40% of people by 2030 who are currently living without access to electricity. And off-grid companies are at the front lines to deliver these products and services. So my last point to you before I hand it over to Andrea is remember this: energy access goals cannot be achieved without financially sustainable off-grid companies. So with that, Andrea, I invite you to take us through the report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction. In fact, I usually start this presentation with a couple of minutes of explanation on the report, but you covered that perfectly. My name is Andrea Arricale. I'm an energy specialist consultant with ESMAP, working closely with Fanny and Raihan, who are also here. And I was the focal point for ESMAP for this report, working closely with many colleagues, including, I really want to mention Charlie Miller, who's also attending this webinar on the other side. I am going to share a brief presentation on the key takeaways of the market trend report, and then walk you through the microsite and the AI chatbots, which is something I'm very excited about. And yeah, looking forward to the conversation. Can you confirm you can see my screen?
Yes, Andrea.
Thank you. As I was briefly mentioning, Sarah gave us fantastic excursus of how did we get here, right? The market trend report has expanded over the years because so has the off-grid solar sector. We started with households and small appliances. We extended to productive uses. And lastly, we've been addressing social infrastructure as well. As the report got bigger and more complex with much more nuanced data, we decided to have some sort of a two-pronged approach. One was to provide the report itself in a PDF format, which contained the core trends and analysis. But also on the other hand, we realized that there were some advanced users that could have benefited from deep dives on specific topics or on technical aspects that involved more data. And for this reason, we created this microsite, including an AI chatbot that allows you to have a dialogue directly with the market trend report as well as other core documents. But let me start by sharing what the market trend report actually found out this year. Now, this is no news to, I guess, all of us in the sector. The fact that the population growth actually surpassed the expansion of electricity access in 2022. This interrupted a trend of almost 2 decades where population unelectrified was constantly decreasing, but this changed in the last year. This really shows that in order to achieve SDG 7 and other ambitious objectives related to energy access, we really have to change the pace at which we are providing electricity. And what these figures don't show are also 2 things. The first is that the access deficits are really focused in sub-Saharan Africa, which comprises 85% of the unelectrified population. And secondly, that the people that are now left to electrify are living in the poorest and most remote area, posing additional challenges to the sector, which is mostly private sector driven. 50% of the people lacking access in sub-Saharan Africa are in the 5 big access deficit countries, that is Nigeria, DRC, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Uganda. The current trends show that by 2030, 660 million people will still be living without electricity. Now, about the off-grid solar sector, you can see that there was a big dip in terms of sales during the pandemic, and the sector recovered quite well in 2022, showing a remarkable sale. In 2023, the sector showed a marginal decrease. And this is really despite very challenging conditions that have affected the sector and the macroeconomic picture globally, especially in sub-Saharan Africa over the past couple of years. One more nuanced aspect that you can see in the market trend report is also that actually lower value products, particularly single light and portable system, have actually shown resilience and their sales have increased, but higher value products have declined, really showing how sales have been affected by affordability and by challenges related to products sold in local currency. But let me tell you a little more about this. There are 3 core challenges that have strained the sector. The first one is fluctuation of currency, right? Some currencies like Kenyan shilling and Nigerian naira have seen so much depreciation and in some cases devaluation up to extraordinary figures like 300%. These, coupled with generalized inflation in sub-Saharan Africa that averaging 16%, and then the high interest rates that were put in place by central banks to combat inflation, paints a very difficult picture for the sector. Because as I'm sure most of you know, one of the characteristics of the sector is that many receivables are in local currencies, but the payables are in dollars. So when the fluctuations are in place, the sector is in strain. But in addition to this, we also have an issue with currency and convertibility. Because, for example, Malawi and Ethiopia have faced this type of challenges as a consequence of shortage in foreign exchange currency and restriction in conversion. So when we saw those figures on resilience, they were actually very promising because given that this was the global picture, the sector is really showing remarkable strength. Moving on. We saw the supply side of the picture, but let's look at the demand. Off-grid solar sector is poised to serve now the most remote and rural. In no country in the world has universal electrification been achieved without public intervention. Yet, what we are doing here through the off-grid solar system is really tackling electricity needs in some of the poorest and lowest income communities in the world. We're talking about more than 80% people living in FCV or rural region, and 3/4 of them concentrated in conflict-afflicted area like Nigeria, Ethiopia, DRC, and 200 million people are living in active conflict zone. What we have seen that through our analysis, which of course you're very welcome to check the market trend report for the detailed figure, that is about 60% more expensive to serve this FCV and remote region. And at the same time, households have volatile incomes, they're physically harder to reach, and factoring in all these costs that have to be borne by the companies and then have to be passed on to consumers for profitability, we are seeing that only 22% of the people who currently lack access can afford comfortably the cost of a tier 1 system through pay. 22%, about 1 in 5 people. Now, if we use the affordable as a stretch approach, and this affordability means the cost of electricity, in this case, the cost of a tier one PAYGO system with PAYGO, covers 5% that is of the monthly budget of a household that is considered affordable. If we stretch this income portion of income spent on electricity to 10%, we have a total of 49% people that can afford a tier one system through PAYGO. That still leaves out 51% of the people without electricity. Now, if we increase the size of the system and the electricity provided, going to tier two, you will see that only 1% of people without electricity can actually afford a solar system. This points to a really, really big challenge that we have to address. Moving on, off-grid solar is critical to closing the energy access gap, but energy access is threefold, as we were saying. We have households on the one end, we have productive uses, but we also have social infrastructure. And there are very big targets for which off-grid solar represents the least cost solution for electrification. Off-grid solar is a vibrant market. 55% of the new connection in sub-Saharan Africa between 2020 and 2022 are due to off-grid solar system. And according to least cost electrification, 41% of the about 1 billion new household connection that are needed to reach SDG 7, 1 billion people that are needed to reach SDG 7 by 2023 are best served through off-grid solar. But of course, then we also have farmers, we have micro, small, and medium enterprises, we have schools, and we have health facilities. Talking about households, there are huge advantages to using off-grid solar. Of course, this is going beyond actual electricity, right? We are noting, first of all, from our research, that about 1 system in 6 is used not just for household. So every solar system that is given to a household is used not just for lighting and household duties, but also for productive uses. And utilizing off-grid solar to electrify these 400 million people can save up to 16 or 17 billion per year, roughly $140 per household, by reducing spend on actual fuels like kerosene that is used for lighting, but also for increasing incomes. The social benefits are clear because a study in Kenya found that electricity access can free up to 17 hours per month for women and girls to spend on education and leisure. So the social benefits are enormous, as well as the financial benefits that we have seen here. Moving to productive uses, this is also very critical because we've seen that using off-grid solar to replace diesel generator can save up to 13 billion yearly in fuel costs. And farmer can increase income up to 35% through solar irrigation, cold storage, and similar productive use appliances. Moving on, last but not least, it is hard to imagine the provision of healthcare services and education services without electricity. Yet this is the reality in many places in Africa. Electrifying healthcare facilities and schools can avoid 0.9 megaton CO2 equivalent emission on a yearly basis, can increase outpatient services by about 60% and enable to offer them continued services, but also allow to increase school enrollment and completion rates. This is for about 800% facilities across Africa. So the message is clear. How do we enable off-grid solar to achieve all these lofty objectives? So this is where things become challenging. The historical investment in off-grid solar has been 3.5 billion. And we need roughly about that annually to achieve the $21 billion that is required to meet SDG 7 through off-grid solar, that is electrifying the 400 million people who are best electrified through off-grid solar. Not the entire electricity access gap, obviously, but just that portion that is best served by off-grid solar. We're we are off track to meet this, but the goal is not out of sight. We've seen the figures that are unlocked by providing off-grid solar. 21 billion is only a portion of that, and is less than 50 billion spent on fuel subsidies in sub-Saharan Africa yearly. Now, if we want to electrify also productive uses of electricity, providing appliances to farmers and enterprises, an additional 74 billion is needed. But then if we also want to electrify schools and health centers, only further $2 billion are needed. Now, what these figures paint is a complex figure that requires us to really step up our game. But let me delve a little further into this 21 billion that we're seeing here for households. It's not just a matter of how much do we provide, but also what. We are seeing before two types of challenges. On the supply side, that companies are struggling to achieve profitability, and they lack enough financial robustness to venture into new markets where people are particularly poor or they're logistically remote. But that's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is that there is an affordability gap that just cannot be covered by the private sector. That is why this division of or allocation of the type of support that is required is divided in debt, equity, and grant, which are all critical. Particular debt in local currency that is required for companies to sustain operations, equity that is required to scale up, and grant that is required to make it viable, but also subsidies. And these subsidies are particularly on the end user side that require long-term commitment, because it's important that providing confidence to investors that won't be a cliff edge as subsidies are reduced. And this subsidy can unlock $10 billion of commercial investment. But let me move forward to this and just show you what are the opportunities that we have highlighted, and I'll be brief. I will encourage you to really look at the market trend report, because there is a beautiful game changer graph that puts this the main trends that we have identified in on a matrix on likelihood and impact. But these are the four, let's say, overarching or cross-cutting trends that we have seen across these many trends. These are four. First one is to improve commercial viability. The second is to push off-grid solar companies to reach unelectrified customers, and particularly using the right type of subsidies, grant, to make this viable. The third is really to move beyond PAYGO, because there is a large portion of the unelectrified that needs to be reached, and there is no affordability. So how can we make that happen? And lastly, to accelerate productive use and social infrastructure. On the first aspect, I touched just a little bit upon that, but it's really critical that we enhance local currency financing that would allow us to mitigate forex fluctuation risks. So providing local currency financing would reduce this risk for companies and investors, and then allow them to actually focus on operation. And we have Patrick here from Sun King. Sun King has driven a Kenyan shilling denominated securitization facility in 2023, equivalent to $130 million. And there are a few other examples, but we're still not there, and this needs to be increased. A second model to move beyond PAYGO is to enhance public-private partnership models, including energy as a service, which allow companies to handle operation and distribution, to cover operation and distribution only, and utilizing grants and other donor support to cover the capital cost. And there are a few ideas that we've seen even pitched at the GOGLA forum, including SolarAid and Moon joint effort, where they have piloted infrastructure type model, including in Togo and Malawi. But let me close here with the last aspect that I'd like to touch upon. Utilizing models that rely on data aggregation and artificial intelligence to make aggregate the demand and adapt business model for electrification of productive uses and social infrastructure. This is a way to lower the cost and serve customers in a way that link payments to the benefits of to farmers or micro enterprises, including through digital tools that identify demand and therefore provide confidence in investors. There are a few examples here. I will just mention Prospect, which is an open source data platform that allows to customize the data flows coming from grid, mini grid, and off grid sources. And this type of tools are really critical to achieve what we're planning. This is the call to action that we have here. And actually, this is a question, 4 questions for each stakeholder. And how do we address the gaps that we have seen? How can governments incorporate off-grid solar in their national electrification plans? This is something that we often see, that the technology options are actually competing. But we have to think on how to work holistically, because off-grid solar is a resource. And it's a resource in terms of least cost electrification, but it's also an immediate relief for people who are currently without access. Then we move into development partner. How can we provide sufficient end user subsidies to encourage reaching the hardest to reach population? Then we're moving on to investors. How can they provide flexible, particular patient capital and at affordable returns? What is needed to unlock this? And then finally, the private sector. How can we encourage private sector to create business model that serve households in the most remote areas, but also that address productive uses and social institutions? This is the brief presentation I wanted to share on the market trend report. But one little thing is missing, which is I am really eager to show you how this microsite and AI chatbot look like. Here you see our 3-pronged approach for this report. We have the core trends captured in the main PDF, but we also have some customizable resources like the microsite and the chatbot that I'll show you in a second. I'll stop sharing my screen right now, and I'll share it again with the right microsite and chatbot window. Just bear with me. Okay, just a second, it's loading. There you go. I take it that you can see the screen. So welcome to the landing page of the market trend report microsite. The objective of this microsite is very simple. We're just going to showcase the main takeaways from the microsite. So not exactly the whole thing, but just the takeaways from the report, structured by chapters, providing additional content in deep dives, and providing data that can be explored. Let me just show you this. This is a map of the energy access gap. You can hover by country, and it's telling you what the access gap is. You can filter by type of population. You can filter by FCV or not country. And then, of course, there are other resources. For example, this is the number of people to be electrified by technology, and you can select any country that you want. And these are just 2 very quick resources that I'm providing, but also a quick deep dive on a chapter would show you how the chapter looks like, in addition to some graphs that are interactive and the data can be downloaded. You can play with it as much as you want. It's you're very encouraged to do so. And note that the market trend report itself has mini links in the report that you can click on and will take you to graphs on the microsite. But this is one of the 2 things I wanted to show you. The second thing is that you can see here in the bottom right corner that a little light bulb is asking whether you want to know more and to ask the market trend report assistant. Well, here it is. This is our chatbot. And the beauty of this chatbot is that, unlike ChatGPT, this chatbot is taking information exclusively from selected sources. These include market trend report from this year and past years, includes ESMAP reports, including GOGLA reports, SE4O reports, 60 decibel, and a few other trusted partners, so that we can stand by the information that it's provided. And the chatbot is not going to try to give you an answer to anything you ask, right? If you ask a recipe for a fish soup, it's not going to give it to you. But the moment you're asking for an off-grid solar related question, is going to give you a very detailed answer that you can use for whatever you see fit, so that you don't have to look into this many documents. Now, we also have prompts of the day. They rotate, and you're welcome to suggest more. This is the first one that came today. So what policies are promoting off-grid solar? And I preloaded this answer for you. As you can see, the answer is nice. It's really spot on. It's true. I agree with what the chatbot says. I hope the panelists agree as well. These are some example structure in paragraphs, and you can see that all the answers are sourced. This means that you know exactly why the chatbot is saying a specific thing, and you can double check that this is the right information, or you can delve even deeper on this topic. And you can see that for policies, we have enabling environment, financial incentive, and quality assurance. I could not have responded better myself. So this is really exciting, and I encourage you to play as much as you can and to please give feedback. This is all that I wanted to share with you today. I hope this was just as interesting as and fun as it was for me. Thank you very much, Sarah. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andrea. As someone who spent years in the trenches of report writing, the fact that you can download those graphs is amazing. Really takes the MTR to a whole nother level. So thank you so much for the presentation and for the demonstration of the microsite. Really great job. Thank you. So now we're going to turn to some questions with our panelists. And Fanny, I am going to start with you. So the MTR provides some essential data about the state of the off-grid sector and positions off-grid solar as central to delivering energy access to upwards of 40% of people without access to electricity. The World Bank and the AFDB have launched the Mission 300 initiative to provide access to 300 million people living in Africa. How does off-grid solar fit into the Mission 300 partnership?
Thank you so much, Sarah, first of all, for having us in this important GOGLA webinar, and secondly, for the really wonderful partnership we've had with you over the years, and the important role that GOGLA plays in this space in supporting a key industry that can cost-effectively electrify people and provide them with safe, reliable energy services. Let me just explain a little bit what this M300 is about. The World Bank earlier this year adopted, in partnership with the African Development Bank, a target of electrifying 300 million people, or providing the financing to it, of electrifying 300 million people in Africa, of which we at the World Bank would finance 250 million people, and the African Development Bank 50 million people. And this is really the first time the World Bank has set itself a target like this. And it's really focused everyone's mind to get this done. And certainly the reports earlier on not being on track on SDG 7 have helped focus everyone's mind on this. Now, reports such as the one as the off-grid solar market trend reports are critical in informing us where the gaps lie, and also where how we can best meet the electrification target. And clearly it shows that off-grid solars along the lines of plug and play, etc., that are being offered on the market are least cost And as you're saying, the report finds for 40% of future electricity connections, but also it's very quick and easy to deploy. We believe this is really part and parcel of what has to be the solution going forward. Off-grid solar is scalable, it's affordable, and it provides immediate access to remote and underserved areas. Clearly, the private sector also plays a very important role in this and is also quite agile in addressing the needs of the demand. I'd also like to stress the need for enhanced energy services for improved health and education outcomes that can also be well addressed and are focused under the M300 umbrella of the World Bank going forward.
Thank you, Fanny. Raihan, so Fanny just mentioned that off-grid solar is, she said, quick and easy to deploy. So let me ask you, what are the barriers to accelerating the deployment of off-grid products and services? And what steps can the World Bank and other MDBs and DFIs take to overcome these challenges?
Thank you, Sarah. And I also wanted to thank GOGLA for organizing this. And I see that there are more than 100 participants. So thanks to the participants as well for joining this seminar, this webinar. The question you asked is very critical. You know, I mean, in one hand, we believe that off-grid solar is very quick to install and probably easiest approach towards electrification. But then when we look at the graph that Andrea showed in his presentation, that from 1.2 billion several years ago, we have come down to 685 million people. And then if we maintain the current trend, the number of people without electricity will still be 600 million in 2030. That is very mind-boggling because, I mean, if we are keeping the current trend, still that will be the case. And that actually relates to the fact that it was relatively easier to electrify more people from 1.2 billion to 685 million. But now these remaining 685 million people are probably the hardest to reach. And you have also seen that breakdown that 82% of these people live in FCV settings, you know, I mean, they're affected with fragility, conflict, violence. Only 22% of them can actually afford the cost of solar. And when we are talking about deploying solar, we are not talking about giving them for free. We are talking about private sector engaged in a business so they can sell the solar products and make a reasonable return so that they have a sustainable business to operate. I think that's where the challenge is, to make business by selling technologies which are most often imported in countries to people who cannot afford them. So if I lay it out, it sounds like a business which is not viable. But that's why we also cannot expect the private sector to be responsible to carry out this task. There has to be a partnership from the government, because at the end of the day, it is the government who wants to electrify their citizens. And the question is, can governments partner with the private sector so that this good business model and the efficiency of the private sector can be used, and government can provide the needed financing gap or the viability gap, which can make the businesses affordable. I think that's the biggest challenge, that's the biggest barrier. And all the activities that World Bank and other MDBs are doing is trying to see how we can engage governments in doing that, how we can support not only international solar companies, but also establish and build capacity of the local entrepreneurs, how we can bring in local currency financing, risk mitigation, facilities, and so forth to make it a viable business. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Raihan. So Patrick, over to you. So Raihan mentioned this sort of viability gap, and off-grid companies like Sun King are commercial companies. They often work in fragile markets and deliver products and services to hard-to-reach consumers with very little ability to pay. So given this mandate to be commercially viable and support energy access goals like Mission 300, what do the off-grid companies require to both scale and be financially sustainable?
So I think, Mission 300 is fantastic in that it is a clear call for a public-private partnership. I'll start by saying I think that the private sector on its own has a lot that it can do without public support, and that we should challenge ourselves as private sector entities to work on. And those are, just the nitty-gritty execution challenges of operating one of these businesses. Affordability is clearly our biggest challenge as an industry. So we need to figure out how to continue reducing the cost of these products. That's not just manufacturing. The biggest part of the cost is the distribution and financing. So how can we reduce the cost of those distribution channels through economies of scale, through efficiency, through innovation, software, just good, solid, on the ground execution efficiency. That's really the name of the game. There's also, I think, a lot that the private sector can do to just refocus on what is working and what is affordable for these consumers. So, at Sun King, we're working on all of this new futuristic stuff, big solar inverters and, productive use stuff and, systems that can power, laptops and televisions and you name it. But I honestly think that the private sector has gotten a little bit distracted by that stuff, by what's new. I think there's always a tendency as innovators, as entrepreneurs, as engineers, to look for solutions in what's new. And there already is a category of products that is working, which is like Andrea was saying. We've already seen growth recently in the entry level in products that are providing just one light plus a phone charger, meeting people's very basic energy needs. And I think it would be a real shame if, as an industry, we didn't roll those out to everybody who needs them. With those bigger, more powerful, more advanced products, continuing to work on those really exciting new things. And bigger is better for everybody, but let's focus on what's affordable right now. And so just refocusing on entry level, I think, is a big thing we can do. And then, of course, we're going to need public-private partnership to really improve affordability, especially for systems that are more powerful, that move people closer to, full-on, SDG targets, especially at the higher tiers, tier 2 and up. The vast majority of people can't afford those products now out of pocket, and even with the very best, most efficient financing and distribution and product, even 5 years from now, they're not going to be able to afford tier 3 and up systems. So, to the extent that governments want to partner on those things, we should be available for that as private sector entities, and trying to figure out how we can do that most efficiently, and trying to see how we can get people access to those higher tiers of service.
Patrick, I want to stick with you for one moment and just follow up on that, because balancing kind of the innovation and kind of the what's new with kind of the what works. I mean, can you give us a little bit more about how you kind of manage your innovation cycle, and to make sure as you go to more rural and hard to reach areas that you're bringing both innovation and balancing with core products? Can you dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it's something we're always trying to do a better job on, and we don't have, the solution to that. But I do think, you know, as these organizations grow, Sun King or any other, they're, you know, just communicating within the organization and trying to make sure that people understand what's going on and everybody's on the same page, and that we're not getting distracted becomes a bigger and bigger challenge. So, you know, we've had to look at certain things in our business and say, you know, what we're trying to do here is just too complicated. You know, we just need to go back to basics. What's actually working? What can we build on? And, you know, innovation isn't just about trying to find some whiz bang new solution. It's also about focusing on the nitty gritty challenges of what's right in front of us. So yeah, I think as we've expanded to new areas, to, you know, new products, trying to focus not just on, you know, something that's brand new, but something that's a real improvement on something that already exists.
Great, thank you. Fanny, I'm going to move over to you. So sort of pulling back to the financing question again, when the MTR points to this financing gap, and it's particularly hard for smaller companies and smaller players in the industry, how specifically is the World Bank and partnerships like Mission 300 working to close the financing gap and looking at smaller companies in particular and their needs in closing that gap?
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this question, which is, you know, which is of the essence, really. Let me just put the $21 billion that Andrea talked about earlier, you know, until 2030 into context. Every year, globally, fossil fuel subsidies in the amount of $1 trillion are made available. So I think the matter is not necessarily one that lacks financing or energy, for that matter, but a more, you know, a question of who gets what financing. So I think as the World Bank, we see M300 as a vehicle with which we are also engaging in an energy sector dialogue with our partner countries in Africa to see whether and how policies and measures can be optimized, improved in order and with a view of making the financing of the last mile electrification more viable. Because we really strongly believe electrification for all is so critically important. At ESMAP specifically, we've been looking at, you know, developing financing tools and financial structuring to address some of the critical problems that local smaller companies, you know, face, such as the cost of financing, volatility of currencies, limited access to local financing, and also the very high transaction costs for relatively small, you know, ticket sizes of sales. And the tools that we've been looking to develop together with our partner countries is results-based financing models, blended financing, combining grants, concessional financing, providing more local financing to companies, and you know, ensure end user subsidies are available. And if it means channeling subsidies, that's also part of an important dialogue to have. Guarantees are part of our risk mitigation packages that the World Bank can deploy. But I think the solution is really only found if all stakeholders in the market, both you know, from the private sector, the end users, as well as government and financing institutions, pull together to finding viable solutions. And we are ready to do so. Sarah, I really want to thank you for having me. Unfortunately, I have to bail out now, but I would love to hear from my colleagues how the closing out of the webinar went. And thank you so much for having me.
Fanny, thank you so much. Thank you for your partnership and for joining us, and look forward to working with you on this. Okay, Raihan, I'm gonna turn this to you, and we're gonna enter the realm of public institutions. So providing electricity to public institutions like schools and health centers, it's a big priority, particularly for national governments. You know, what lessons have you learned so far in supporting these initiatives? What business models seem to work? And can you comment a little bit on the payment models and the ability for public institutions to actually support gaining access as a consumer and end user?
Thank you, Sarah. Before coming to specifically answering this question, I'd just like to tie some of the things that both Patrick and Fanny has talked about. I think that's important because Fanny talked about that every year there is $1 trillion of subsidy which goes to the fossil fuel industry in most of the developing countries. And that's the amount of subsidy, actual cash that gets transferred for, let's say, importing fossil fuels to support the local industry. And then Patrick, you also mentioned about, I actually liked it what you said, that how you, private sector, can improve and reduce their cost and make the businesses more viable. And not forget the basics, one light system with mobile phone charging, how that can be provided to the people. And then the challenge that they have is this, 1 in 5 people can afford it. And probably they can afford it because probably your current operating cost in those areas are at a current level. And if you can reduce the current operating cost, probably more people can afford it. I think that's what you are hinting at. And I just wanted to mention that many of our markets, if you're not focused only on household electrification, but also on productive uses, many of those households who live in those areas, probably they are farmers and using diesel irrigation and diesel water pumps for irrigation. They may be using for many other things for diesel or fossil fuels, which are currently part of that 1 trillion subsidy. So somehow, if the private sector can also step in with more aggressive marketing on PUE, maybe that could be one way of reducing your overall cost of operating and making it more viable to support households with tier 1 level service. Just a thought. Now, coming back to your question about providing electrification through public institutions and what business models do we have and working, my honest answer to you is that today I don't have a business model which I can say is working, but I have several business models that we have tried and tested and can tell you that it doesn't work. I mean, those ones that we tried doesn't work. So I think there is an opportunity of trying something new and not continuing with a business model that we know doesn't work. For example, I mean, of course, I would want a health center and school to be electrified by grid electricity if the grid is nearby and within the reach. And if the grid has reliable electric supply, then of course I want the health center and schools to be electrified by the grid. But we know that more than 700,000 schools and 60,000 health centers are in areas which is far from grid. And some of them are today using diesel gensets, and some of them have tried to use solar systems, which they installed by themselves to electrify the health centers and schools. And both of these two models don't work. It doesn't work because most of the times when we surveyed, we found that, first of all, they don't have enough budget to pay for the diesel for more than 10 days of a month. So after 10 days, they don't have any diesel to buy it for. They don't have enough budget. So some days the health center school has electricity, and then the rest of the days of the month, they don't have electricity because they could not have the budget for diesel. And then those got electrified with solar systems. I mean, we go there and we see that there are 3 sets of solar systems because the first one was probably bought by one donor. They bought it and then they were maintained it. It stopped working after probably 2 years. And then they went to another donor and bought a second system. Again, they didn't maintain it. And then probably they are looking for a third donor now. So again, I would like to say that this is another model which many of the DFIs have been supporting because they thought it's a very smart and ingenious way to electrify health centers and schools. But if somehow government is not maintaining the systems, if there's not enough budget provided to them, then even with all the good wishes of the donors, that also don't work. So given this, we have been exploring what can work. We have been discussing with the private sector, how can they engage? And we have been discussing with our health ministry colleagues and education ministry colleagues and also our colleagues in the bank. And we are trying to see whether a model works where it will be a long-term performance-based service contract, which the private sector will enter in with the government. Private sector will own the systems. It's just like a pay-as-you-go system, but now it's not a household, it's a public institution. Now, so technically, and this model works because if pay-go for households work, pay-go for health facilities should also work. So that's our basis of why this model should work. But then we also identified risks that now it's not a household who should be paying, it is the Ministry of Health and Education who should be paying. And we all know how scared private sector gets when their payment depends on government budget. So we are also working with our colleagues in IFC and MIGA to see whether we can design a risk mitigation instrument which can address this risk that the private sector is taking. In case of default for a certain time, is there a liquidity arrangement that we can provide? So the private sector, if they're providing electricity service at a certain level of performance, their payment should not be fluctuating. There should be some assurance of some payment, and whether World Bank, IFC, or MIGA and other DFIs can provide that level of support. And if that is provided, can governments engage private sector, and can we adopt this model? We are trying this in certain countries. We are working in Uganda, which is most advanced. We are a bit working in Nigeria and Benin at a very pilot scale to test out some of the legal agreements as well, because one is a francophone, one is an anglophone country, and their legal instruments are different, regulatory systems are different. So these are some of the things that we are trying and testing, and we hope that some of the results will give us new lessons learned and strengthen this business model. This is the approach right now we are taking because we know the existing business models don't work, and we hope this model will give us some results. Sarah.
Patrick, Raihan put a lot out there, and I think there's a lot that you could probably respond to, starting with more aggressive marketing around PUE to the ideas of longer term service contracts, and even the role as government as the end payer and how that kind of resonates with private sector companies. So can I ask you to come in and respond to some of Raihan's points?
Yeah, I think it'll be hard for me to give a proper response on the fly on the exact model for government financing, because I think the devil's always in the details there, and it's all about the nitty gritty, how that's implemented. But so I think any mechanism that brings in additional public funding, we can work with. It's like the 30 caveats to that, exactly how it works, that are going to be the challenge. In terms of productive use or other larger systems cross-subsidizing smaller products, I think it's very possible. And I think these businesses are also experimenting with with additional product lines of all different sorts. And the more the more sort of generalist these distribution channels can become, there is the potential there for reduced fraction of support costs and fixed operating costs through amortization. So I think there's a real potential there, but I also think there's room for companies to just kind of get distracted and not continue to focus on that entry level. Because to be honest, it's a lot easier to build a business doing almost anything other than very entry-level off-grid solar. So if you start building these other businesses, are you going to keep a focus on this core challenge that we as an industry have been trying to solve for, for 20 years now or more? That's the question. And so I think keeping an eye on that is maybe the hardest part, while finding other ways of making the products more affordable through efficiency, through cross-subsidization, amortizing costs in other ways. Absolutely, we should do all of the above.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to Andrea to pull from some of the MTR around this question of how do we demonstrate the sort of economic impact of off-grid solar. And one way that people are looking at it is through productive use. And you did put out some examples of cost savings and productivity. And I'd just be curious, from a data perspective, how would you position off-grid solar as something that really stimulates and drives the economy, creates jobs? And Andrea, maybe if I can start with you on that.
Sure, Sarah, thank you so much. I shared a couple of core figures. We have to think of off-grid solar as an enabler, right, of a better quality of life. That's really the main point here. That's where we start. There is a life with electricity and a life without electricity. Once you turn on the light, your life changes, right? So that's really the first layer. But then let's move to the second layer, which is the figure that I showed, that research demonstrates that 16% of the solar home system that are used in households are actually used to generate income, right? And this income generation, it's because of additional activities, but also it's an increased budget that is available at the on a monthly basis, because you don't spend on kerosene and you don't spend on alternative sources of fuel, right? That's really the first thing. The second thing is, when we are talking about sheer productive uses of electricity, Raihan mentioned that it's when you're thinking of, for example, when you have to use a manual water pump, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of time, it's inefficient. Or when you actually have to use a diesel generator for that, it's costly, right? So the cost on one, displacing diesel generation, and the ongoing expenses that are just going to get worse, right? Because you also imagine that the farmers that we are going to be to address over the next years are the one in most remote areas, right? So just the logistical challenges to get fuel to those areas, it's going to be more costly, right? So displacing diesel and at the same time increasing livelihoods, that's an enormous opportunity. And that can go from solar water pump, or you can even think of cold chain solution that allows, for example, produce to last longer, right? Therefore, getting more income per harvest, right? But then you're also thinking of the last layer. The last layer is what happens in public institutions, right? There are some public institutions that have absolutely no electricity. There are some that have diesel generators and they try to make it work. There are some that are connected to the grid and can't actually afford it. That is just a few, they just have a few days, because the government knows that public institution can't pay. So instead of having postpaid meters, they have prepaid meters. So what happens in those contexts is that after a number of days, the electricity just gets shut down, right? So the very same hospital electrified by the government cannot provide the services that the government requires, which is absurd. This unlocks a potential and savings from diesel to move to solar energy. These are some of the main things that I really see as potential. And off-grid solar itself is a game changer, is a game-changing solution. And what we need to work on is how to make it happen. And I want to stress one point here. Had it been a money problem, we would have solved it. The whole energy access field. had it been an issue that we can throw money at, we would have solved it, right? But it's about what money we provide, and it's about who do we give it to. Because if the governments that in any case are on the driving seat of this electrification effort don't have the capacity to absorb this type of funding, don't have the knowledge to unlock private sector participation, there are no enabling environment policies in place, it can't work. And that is up to a lot of us in terms of development organization to actually support the government on this path to make sure that what we are providing financially can be absorbed and can be best deployed. I wanted to add this little point that is not related to data, but it's related to how do we make it work. Thank you, Sarah.
Andrea, there's a lot in there, including around diesel displacement. And I think the earlier fact about, 1 trillion in fuel subsidies always begs the question of, couldn't we redirect those fuel subsidies towards energy access? But Raihan, I do want to ask you, sort of picking up on the idea of diesel displacement, what is the role of off-grid solar around climate adaptation and resilience? And if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, we haven't marketed it as much as we should have been, I must say that, because when we talk about climate resilience and adaptations in those remote and rural areas, I mean, solar can also play an impressive role there. I mean, it's not only renewable energy that we are offering, but it's also removing or displacing the use of fossil fuel. I mean, households will no longer use kerosene lamps, businesses will no longer use diesel gensets, hospitals and health centers and schools will not use diesel gensets for electrification. So that can actually bring in a lot of climate resilience in our operations, bringing the electrification side of it. And in addition to that, if we can somehow benefit from any sort of carbon finance or carbon credits that we can bring in as an additional source to finance the huge financing need of the sector, I think we should try to see how we can combine all these forces and not only talk about this story as electrification and having light at our house or businesses, but a story of climate resilience and adaptation, and also, securing some of the financing and benefits that can come along with it.
Patrick, I want to ask you, do you, it's a two-part question, do you position Sun King's products and services around climate adaptation and resilience? And the second part of that, can you talk a little bit about accessing carbon financing and some of your experience or views on that?
So we don't really position it to any significant extent as a climate resilience solution. Maybe we should be. I think there are probably sources of climate finance out there, especially for climate finance around adaptation rather than carbon emission reductions, that if we were properly explaining this as an adaptation solution, the industry could probably benefit from sources of capital, like the Green Climate Fund has been talked about as a potential source of capital that's interested in adaptation solutions. But the industry, with a couple of exceptions, hasn't really leveraged that very much yet. In terms of how we access climate finance, we're honestly doing less and less of it. What we've found is that we had some programs around carbon emission reductions that we found to be not realistic in terms of how they were the arithmetic for how they were generating these carbon credits, if you will. And so when we sort of audited those programs a couple of years ago and looked at are these products actually generating carbon emission reductions, meaning there was carbon being emitted, now there's not, That's not actually what's happening with most of these products. What the industry is doing, by and large, is providing more access to energy without increasing carbon emission reductions in the way that a fossil fuel-based energy source would. So in those situations, it's really improper to market carbon credits or carbon emission reductions in the way that, for example, the voluntary carbon market thinks about them. So, you know, the typical way that a carbon credit is explained to the public, the way that companies explain it when they retire these carbon credits is, you're buying a carbon credit, we're retiring it, and that means that we actually reduce the amount of carbon emissions going into the atmosphere. In most cases, that's not what's happening with off-grid solar. What we're actually doing as an industry is allowing people to get access to energy without generating new sources of carbon emissions, which is fantastic, but it's not what the carbon emission reductions markets are typically looking for when they generate what are called carbon credits or carbon emission reductions. So that's something that the industry needs to reflect on and be realistic about what we're doing, because there have been multiple examples in other industries where, you know, for example, in the cook stove industry or the forest preservation industry, where sort of a bubble has been created around generating carbon emission reductions that were not realistic. And that's not a sustainable way of generating financing for any industry or any program. So if the industry goes down that path of generating essentially false carbon emission reductions, we're going to have a serious problem on our hands that we've seen in other industries. We don't want to see off-grid solar go down that path. But there are absolutely, when you look at adaptation, when you look at how can the world generate more energy without generating more carbon emissions, that's absolutely what off-grid solar is doing. And we should look at ways of financing it from that angle.
Thank you. I am trying to pick some questions now so they're going to feel a little, they're a little diverse in their perspective, but I want to capture a couple of these questions, and I will try to read through a few. Okay, so one is, what are the main trends of off-grid solar capacity per unit for households in East and West Africa? Patrick, is that a question you can take on?
What are the, say it again, what are the carbon in East and West Africa? And I missed the first part.
It's what are the main trends of off-grid solar capacity per unit? So I think, yeah, so
I saw that one. I wasn't sure what they meant by capacity. If that's the, you know, solar, you know, the size of the solar panels per unit. I think, as Andrea mentioned, I think that's actually been on a slight downwards trend, because what we've seen is, you know, people are buying more entry-level products with, you know, smaller solar panels, where it's a really affordable product that does the very basics, provides basic lighting and phone charging, but is not capable of powering these larger appliances. That's sort of the recent trend that we've been seeing, is just not necessarily a reduction, a significant reduction in the number of larger products that's being sold, but you know, we are definitely seeing at Sun King a huge growth in those in that entry level category as we focus on it and try and roll that out.
Great. There's another question, and Patrick, maybe I'll have you start and then ask others to chime in. And this is about sort of data around repair and maintenance of products. There was a recent SolarAid report on maintenance and repair. Do you see a need to build in future reports on data around repair? So Patrick, why don't I start with you, and then I'll go over to the data side. Can you talk a little bit about sort of maintenance and repair and the data on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I have to look at that exact report and how they were looking at the data, but of course, servicing customers, you know, needs for repair, whether it's through repair or replacement, is an absolute necessity. Probably the very most important thing we as companies can do is provide products that work, and when they don't work, fix them quickly. So yeah, it's a huge focus. And then, you know, whether you're doing that through repairs, replacements, finding the most efficient ways of getting that warranty service done is essential. So I think more data around that would be great.
Raihan, can you touch on kind of the standards and verification and particularly looking at it from the energy access lens? How are we making sure that quality products and verified products are reaching consumers?
Good question, Sarah. I'm saying it's a good question because, as you know, the market trends reports has identified that there's a big difference between affiliate companies or affiliate products and non-affiliate products. And we don't actually know how the non-affiliate products are performing in terms of standards or quality because no test has been done on them. But what we from the World Bank are doing is that, you know, first of all, we are supporting Verasol along with other donors so that there is a voice on standards of solar quality framework. We are trying to see how we can expand their work so that it's not only focuses on up to 350 watt plug and play solar systems, but also it can focus on appliances or compliances for protective uses, some use of public institutions and so forth. What we have done is that in most of the countries where we have engaged with financing through the government, we either engage with the regulatory agency or the government's Bureau of Standards or Standards Institute to see whether the Verasol standard can be adopted in that country. We want to make sure that our funding support goes to tier 1 and above solar systems so that those who are government supporting to get electricity access can be counted against HG7 targets. And of course, we all the RBF schemes that we have funded, and we have come to know that many other RBF schemes of many donors are also using the Verasol standards and Verasol database before our results-based financing is passed on to the private sector. So there are several ways that we are trying to enforce the standards mechanism, but I think more needs to be done. There has to be we have to see how this standard scheme doesn't need to depend fully on donor funding, because now as the market is growing, there are almost $3.2 billion already invested. More than 400 million people are benefiting from these products, and we expect another 400 million people will be benefiting only for households. We would also like to see that the standard scheme of Verasol also somehow becomes market supported. Some core activities I'm sure can be supported by donors, but we like to see this taken up by them as well. That I'd like to state about your question, Sarah.
Thank you. And Andrea, do you have anything to add on the data side? How would we incorporate this into an MTR in the future?
Thank you, Sarah. I actually wanted to touch upon the repair question because I think it's a very valid one. So just recently and very quietly, we ESMAP launched an off-grid solar e-waste management toolkit. So what we are trying to do is trying to provide more operationally oriented documents, right? Because our job at the bank is really to have lending operation to be on the field. And what we want to try to do as ESMAP is to inform what are the best practices, right? We just said off-grid solar is the best solution for 400 million people. So that means that there are going to be hundreds of millions of off-grid solar system, right? And they have a life cycle, and then what happens after that, right? This is something, and if the sector is already struggling to achieve profitability, then what do? We include all sorts of environmental and social requirements. It ends up being more costly, and the sector can't absorb that, right? So what we try to do with this e-waste toolkit is to identify what are the best practices in terms of e-waste management, with the idea that you want the least e-waste as possible. right? So in the pyramid, you start with reduce, reuse, repair, refurbish, and then recycle, right? So we classified all the intervention, particularly from a bank/donor perspective, can be done. And it's a little counterintuitive because you would assume that, for example, when you set up an RBF scheme, an RBF facility, in a country, you would require companies to have mandatory recycling or storage. Or in truth, so many companies, especially as we're going towards the smaller distributors, they really can't do that. They don't have the financial capacity. They don't have the technical capacity. Many times, the country doesn't even have a recycling facility. So what's happening there, right? What we try to do is to highlight what is the best practice in the system, noting that particularly small players, but generally everybody in the sector, has to build this capacity, and we are there to support them. So the core point that I'm trying to make here is that the answer is not prescriptive, is supportive. How to support companies into integrating environmental practices so that they benefit them as well. Is it a lack of capacity? Is it a lack of infrastructure, of technical requirements? How can we make sure that we incentivize the companies to serve these products for the long term? Because we give a solar system to somebody and then we tick the box and say that person is electrified. In truth, if after 1 year or 2 years the system doesn't work anymore, it's out of warranty, it gets very complicated to consider those people electrified as well, right? So how do we incentivize long-term service? How do we incentivize environmental best practices that include repair, include refurbishment? And then finally, how do we incentivize recycling best practices for companies? A lot of this relates to aggregation, for example, having extended producer responsibility schemes, and support government into making this happen, and the private sector into what they need, technical assistance, grants, and so on and so forth. So I would encourage you to read this report. We're having another webinar in the coming months on this, but yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Okay, Patrick, I'd love to just get you to chime in because I think there was a lot of recommendations about being prescriptive versus supportive, but what responsibility does the private sector have around e-waste, and how can we improve it?
Well, I think that, like Andrea said, the e-waste, mitigation is a huge industry of its own, right? And I think that it's very reasonable to ask companies generating e-waste to, use commercially reasonable means of interfacing with those with that industry, right? If there is a disposal channel, to take advantage of it. Whether each individual electronics company can generate its own recycling plant or something like that, clearly that's not realistic. So we just have to work with what's there, and also challenge ourselves to do as much as we can. So we're fully on board with trying to do whatever governments think is the right thing to do. And clearly, like, governments also figure out when they ask for too much. I mean, Kenya had, a program that, was gonna put a giant, eco levy on products, and decided to roll that back, for whatever reasons. But I think governments can be the judge of what is the right thing for companies to do, and we'll comply with that.
Thank you. Okay, we are in our final minute, so I've got a really quick popcorn round question for you. What are the 2 recommendations you would make to a national government to support the acceleration of the off-grid sector in their country? And Patrick, I'll start with you. 2 recommendations.
I mean, the biggest 2 would be, reduce taxes on off-grid solar equipment. That's, I don't know how many government folks are on the call, but the fact is there's still a lot of taxes being paid by some of the poorest folks in the world on products that they desperately need for basic, lighting and phone charging. And that clearly doesn't make sense. Those are highly regressive taxes that, it's just a matter of how can we get them out. And I think at a fundamental level, everybody would agree with that. But there are some nitty-gritty day-to-day challenges with how we can do that. And then going beyond that, providing, sustainable, long-term, results-based financing or subsidy for the products that that people need to improve affordability. Those are the two biggest things that we could possibly do.
Great, thank you. Raihan, can you close us out with this question? What are your two recommendations?
Many recommendations, but coming to two is always hard. So, I think it's important. When we talk to the governments and then we try to emphasize to them the importance of working with the private sector, I have seen that in many countries, the trust gap between government and private sector is reducing. But there are many countries where that relationship has not come to that stage yet. There's still countries which would still like to do things, the governments would like to do things by themselves, even in off-grid areas. And when we say that this is an area where you need to engage private sector, there's a bit of silence from them before they come back. So I think GOGLA also has a role to play, that how can GOGLA reach out to the governments, make them understand that it's a partnership. The access, achieving energy access, universal access can be a partnership where government has a responsibility, but you have the know-how. And then can somehow government form this partnership where for the responsibility, they can somehow provide support by reducing taxes, VATs, and so forth, make doing business easier for the private sector, and where needed, provide end-user subsidies, reserve-based financing. But at the same time, private sector should also reach out and demonstrate that they are also here to support the government in this long-term challenge mitigation, and they're not fly-by-night companies coming in for quick return and profit. That is not the case, but there's a perception issue, and I think we need to address that perception. I think that one recommendation from me, if you can work on it, that's good enough. I don't need to go to the second one.
Well, thank you for mentioning a role for GOGLA there, because we are very focused on working with national governments around this issue and encouraging a better partnership and trust with the private sector and delivering off-grid. So we've reached the end of time. Raihan, thank you. Andrea, thank you. Patrick, thank you. Thank Fanny. We appreciate your partnership, and I want to thank everyone that has joined and asked questions. There's a lot more we can talk about, so I look forward to continuing this conversation. And again, thank you for joining today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to you, Sarah, and Patrick, and Andrea, and Fanny, and all the other participants here. Very rich questions.
Thank you so much, everybody.